Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
So, Dave, I have an important announcement to make. I have not changed my name to Ye.
Okay. Have you changed it to anything else?
Well, I'm thinking of changing it to You know, the end of my name, Cranowit, it ends with ER. And it sort of harkens to a famous myth, the myth of which is actually the very end of Plato's Republic.
Okay.
It's an account of the afterlife. A soldier dies on the battlefield and he comes back to life, and he says he traveled and he learned that in the afterlife, people who did justice were rewarded and people who did injustice were punished in the afterlife. And so it's this big like reinforcement for justice in Plato's Republic. Not that anyone remembers or knows that. And, you know, hey, maybe I can become a pop icon if I just go by the name Well,
maybe Kanye's next move will be writing the book of Ye. Or we'll call you Easy because you have to go through that process first, right? I mean, right. Kanye went from Kanye to Yeezy, and then it got shortened to Ye.
So maybe I'm Erzy, and then I can be Oh man!
Well, I'm just gonna wait for you to. I'm just gonna wait for you to go to a symbol like Prince.
Sometimes I feel stupid talking about stupid people. It's hard to take some of this stuff seriously.
We're gonna walk into a Vino and Veritas event one of these days, and I'm going to introduce you as the man formerly known as the symbol formerly known as Cranowit.
There you go.
I can't say man because by that point
that would be assuming my identity, and I think there aren't many mortal sins left, but I think assuming someone else's identity is. But you know, a serious question. So this guy Kanye West, I don't know him. I don't think you know him personally. He's out there. He seems a little unhinged, and he's saying some weird stuff. He's saying some bad stuff. And you know, one of the questions I have, and I just pose this as a general question for you, for our listeners, like how much influence does a person like Kanye really have? I mean, I know he's been a successful business person. I believe. I really don't know that much about him. He makes music. People download, listen to his music. I think he sells some expensive tennis shoes and maybe some other articles of clothing and things like this. But when his fans are purchasing his products, listening to his music, are his ideas being transferred to them? Like, are they picking up his nuttiness?
Well, let me start before I even answer your question. Let me start by saying I have to be careful, and Ye, Kanye, Mr. West, whatever you want to be called. If I understate any of your influence or understate any of your value, it's not intentional, and it's not me being a part of some Jewish cabal that's against you. And I bring that up because that is one of his major claims right now. But Kanye does have numerous business. I mean, it's not just music and shoes. He owns dozens of businesses. He's actually the wealthiest Black American man on the planet, right? I mean, I did not know that. I think we have it. This is one of those areas you do tread a little lightly because I don't know how being Black is specifically defined. And if you start getting into some of these princes and royalty in some of these Middle Eastern countries, would any of them consider themselves Black? Are they brown? How does all that work? But as far as Black Americans, he is the wealthiest Black American man.
I'm going to interject here just for a moment, and we're going to return to Mr. West, of course. I just want to point out, this is a great opportunity to point out my utter disdain for identity politics and all the group identities. And it was perhaps nowhere highlighted as ridiculously as in the Jim Crow era.
Sure.
That's where they started passing, states and municipalities were passing laws and ordinances saying, whites only in here, no blacks there, or blacks only, and all that kind of nonsense. Gross injustices. And legal questions would come. Some people would sue over these things. And so when it got into a court, the big question was, how Black do you have to be Black, right? When it says no blacks allowed, who counts as black or who counts as white. And so a lot of these southern states would adopt what they called the one drop rule. The one drop rule was if anywhere in a person's lineage going back, anywhere, there is a black person, then you're black. You have a drop of black. So you could be the pastiest, whitest man or woman in the room. And if your great, grandfather or mother was black, you were legally denominated as a Negro.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's just ridiculous.
To that point, and I don't know enough about this for us to have a deep conversation, but if anybody does, I'd welcome some knowledge. There is a growing debate or argument or clash between Black Americans today, between a group that calls themselves FBA, Foundational Black Americans, and actual African Americans, people who have recently come to America from Africa. And
like Elon Musk.
Well, yes, but we're talking about a lot of the black, the very dark skinned black immigrants from Nigeria, Chad, Ethiopia, Sudan, some of these countries that are finding refugee status here. And then there are the fight I've heard, and I've sat in rooms and just listened to these two sides go at it. The foundational Black Americans are the people who say, I can trace my lineage to slavery in the United States or in North America. And I don't like you new immigrants because you're making my chance at getting reparations harder. There's more of us. And so now you're claiming you want reparations as well. And that's going to be a problem.
Right.
So it's this really weird sort of clash that's happening right now. And there's a lot of disdain for each other within those groups right now.
And that is fascinating. It's all part of the ugliness, right? That happens with identity politics. What happens when some Africans, people who live in Africa today, immigrate to the United States and are successful?
Right.
They come here and they discover what's left of freedom in the United States. Maybe they start a business and they build a nice life for themselves and their kids and so on. Does anyone owe anything to them, or do they owe anything to anyone else?
You just hit the nail on the head. There are groups of these FBAs who are saying we want reparations from these immigrants because they would not have been able to come here and be successful if not for the plight of their great-grandparents, of their great-great-great-great-grandparents, those who went through slavery, who fought for civil rights, who had to deal with Jim Crow and all of those things. They're saying if it wasn't for us, you'd have no opportunity to come to this country and find success. And therefore, not only are you not entitled to reparations, you should be paying more than anybody else should.
Right. Because you have privilege.
No.
Right. What a weird spin on the whole idea of privilege. So if you're a dark, black-skinned, Ethiopian, and you immigrate to the United States today, and you build a nice life for yourself, from the point of view of the FBA, you have some kind of privilege.
Yep. That was accountable to them. Now, the question would be, could we trace back slavery to some of these immigrant communities? Could we trace slavery back to their ancestors in Africa who were probably enslaving Black people, some of which at least were enslaving Black people and putting them on ships and sending them to the United States? I think just to wrap up this idea, where you're really going to see this become interesting is it's the FBAs going after people like Ilhan Omar and AOC, right? Ilhan Omar is not an FBA. Her family is not an FBA. Now, obviously, she has all these other family things going on, but they're sitting there saying, wait a minute, you're sitting here and demanding reparations, but you better not be thinking you get any of these.
Right.
That's not how this should work.
Well, and if the past 4 or 5 minutes of discussion makes your head hurt, this is the natural result of identity politics, dividing people into these groups and saying some owe others for this and some get special perks and benefits, and certain groups hate other groups for some reason, right? And this is where Mr. Kanye West, or Ye,
right,
he's feeding into these problems. He's fueling these problems amidst he has a fairly significant following. He has a fairly significant sphere of influence. And but his problem it's not a skin color problem. His problem is he hates Jews.
Right.
Apparently he's got a problem with Jews.
So the problem that we're having, you asked the question about how much does he influence? There are certainly communities, especially within the Black community, in the rap hip hop community, that whatever he says, they listen. They're curious.
Yeah.
Then there's another group that worries me even more. That is listening to him only when he says what they want, and it goes back to George Washington's famous letter in 1790 to the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, where he talks about tolerance. I think there are a number of, I don't even know how to classify them. I wouldn't call them conservatives. I certainly wouldn't call them liberty-minded.
Let's clarify here for our listeners. We've mentioned this before, but this is such an important point. It's worth repeating. When Washington mentioned tolerance, he specifically rejects it.
Right.
He said, here in America, it's not like we talk about tolerance as if one class enjoys its rights because another class of citizens indulges them, right? Or puts up with them. He says, what we have here is a regime in which everybody, all citizens, enjoy their natural rights. And the purpose of the law is to protect everyone. We don't have religious tolerance or civil tolerance or any kind of tolerance. We celebrate the natural rights of every individual citizen.
Which is so important because in every regime in the history of the world that the Jews were inside of, right? As outside of, unless it was Israel, where they were self-governing, every situation the Jews had ever been in until that day under George Washington, the Jews were, if they had any freedoms, it was because another group or a king or a dictator
the
tolerated the Jews being there. They said, yeah, we're going to give you certain perks and benefits because we have the right as the government or as the monarch to decide who gets rights and who doesn't. And I'm going to tolerate you, right?
They were always viewed as foreigners, as outsiders, and their status, therefore, was always dependent upon the ruling powers of wherever they were. And they would change. Sometimes those ruling powers would change their mind. They might grant a degree of tolerance. I mean, this is a sort of a far extreme, gross example, but it's also true. Germany, as you go from the 19 teens and 20s into the 30s and 40s, the regime changed.
Right.
At one point, they say they extend a fairly broad array of civil liberties, civil rights to Jewish people. And then the regime changes and says, yeah, we changed our mind. We're going to revoke those.
Right. The best example that I always go back to is the rule of Charlemagne. When Charlemagne was in charge, the Jews were treated initially horribly. I mean, they were being expelled. They were being exterminated. There was a massive movement to exterminate. And let's remember, probably 95% of the world's Jews lived in what's now West Germany,
right?
Under Charlemagne's rule.
And let me guess, one day Charlemagne had just a magical change of heart, and he woke up one morning and says, "I love Jewish people, and I want to embrace them." In a very altruistic way, with no self-interest.
There was no altruism there at all. For those who don't know this story, Charlemagne decides partway through his leadership, for lack of a better term, partway through his leadership, to join the Holy Roman Church, become part of the Roman Empire. And when he decides to join the Holy Roman Church, they say, okay, now give us all your money, because no one outside of the church is allowed to own money. And especially ideas of usury and making loans to his people and deciding who the winners and losers are. That had to be done by the church.
You can trust us. We're in the Vatican. Just deposit all your gold and silver here.
Now Charlemagne was not a young man at this point in his life, and he had acquired vast amounts of wealth through war. Yeah. Right. Remember, we've talked about those times repeatedly where we talk about it used to be you didn't grow wealth.
Right.
wealth was a pie.
You stole it.
You stole it from other people
through conquest and conquering your neighbors.
And that's what Charlemagne did. He had gone to war and he had built up an enormous wealth. And he said, there is no way I'm giving my wealth to the church. But he knew that none of the people would actually hold his money for him because they were all devoted to the church.
Yeah, they were all Catholics.
So who did he look at?
Who? I mean, this is great, right? It's a very clever Machiavellian move. Who is one group of people within his Catholic empire? Who's one group of people who are never going to be aligned with the Catholic Church, never going to be looking to deposit funds into the Vatican Bank,
and never be afraid that if they don't give their money to the church, that God's going to send them to hell.
Right.
And that was the Jews, and he already had them all enslaved.
Yeah.
So he said, "You're my slaves. You're set to be executed. You know what? It's convenient for me. I'm going to tolerate you. I'm going to keep you around, and you're going to hold my money, and you're going to be in charge of loans." Here's where this gets really interesting. That was in the 900s. That was in the 10th century. And now you fast forward to today and you get Kanye West out there saying the Jews run the banks. The Jews are in charge of the money. The Jews are a cabal controlling our media, controlling our money, controlling everything else. When that whole stereotype started, 1,000, 1,200 years ago?
Yeah.
1,100 years ago, because Charlemagne made a bunch of slaves start holding the money, and everybody didn't like the Jews because they were, through Charlemagne, they were deciding, and people would go, hey, lend me money. I need to borrow. And the Jews would go to Charlemagne and say, what do you want to do with this? And they became the bad guys. And that stereotype has stuck through for over 1,000 years.
There is, I don't know if there's a good scholarly account of this. There might be. If there's not, this would be a fantastic dissertation for a history PhD graduate student, is to track that story of the spread of Catholicism and the influence of the Vatican throughout the Western world, throughout Europe. At the same time, you get the spread of Jewish banks and bankers.
Right.
And it's fascinating because as Catholicism spreads throughout the Western world, of course, the Vatican, Rome is the center of power. Everything is supposed to go to the Vatican, go through the Vatican. And yet you have Jewish banks and owned by Jewish bankers. They're not loyal to the Vatican. They don't claim to be loyal. And other than physical threats, they're not easily intimidated by, they don't care if the Pope denounces them or threatens that they're going to burn in hell. That doesn't really have an influence on them. And that there has to be a tremendous story to be told. I don't know if anybody's told that story.
I've done a lot of that research. You used one word that I would push back on, and that's owned by. The Jews never owned the banks.
Good
they
point.
Simply ran them as slaves.
Right.
The Jews, when the Charlemagne Empire, when Charlemagne fell, the Jews actually, this whole extermination campaign started again. Everybody thinks the Holocaust was this huge event in history, and it absolutely was. But there were campaigns to exterminate Jews for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Every 100 or 200 years, there was another campaign to try to exterminate the Jews. We're going to get rid of them. And people think that there's a lot of us. We have all this control, and Kanye's out there saying we have all this control. There's 13 million Jews on the planet, right? I mean, we still haven't even reached back to the levels that we had before the Holocaust. And there have been campaigns forever trying to exterminate the Jewish people. The Jews, when Charlemagne was gone and they no longer had the protection of Charlemagne, people stopped tolerating them. They went to Poland. They went through the same thing in Poland.
Yep.
And then when they got blamed after some of the priests, the Polish priests had passed, they moved to Russia. And that's sort of the Jewish path from West Germany, where the Romans moved them right around the turn of the millennium.
Just to give people a sense of what that means, that number, you said there are about 13 million Jews in the world. 700 million would be 1% of the human population on planet Earth. 700 million would be 1%.
So
we're talking, less than 1/10% of a very tiny part. Also, I wanted to make this quick connection so people don't think this is just ancient or medieval history. So though the Jews are forced into this these banking operations as literally as slaves, if they want to live, this is what they have to do so that they can keep one king's money safe and away from the Pope and from the Vatican. And so that means there are at least groups of Jews who get a lot of experience of running banks and figuring this stuff out.
More importantly, a lot of experience at accounting. That was where the benefit came, and that was the skill that was taught generation to generation.
And so fast forward to the American founding, and a big fight breaks out in George Washington's first administration over the subject of a bank.
Yep.
And Alexander Hamilton has been studying banks, the history of banks, and he's making the case we really need banks here. Where there are banks, there's incredible business growth and entrepreneurship, right? Because not everyone has the capital to risk to go out on certain. We want banks to be able to make capital available. And you know who opposes Hamilton most vociferously? Thomas Jefferson and his best friend James Madison. And their main argument is banks are the instruments of greedy kings and the people working to, at their interest.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want banks here. That's a monarchical kind of institution. Ordinary people don't need banks.
So let's now talk about what's happening simultaneously in Europe. In Europe at the same time, while they're debating a central bank here, you have the Barbary pirates taking king ships, right? The kings from Britain and France and Spain and Italy. All of these kings are trying to send goods from one to the other, from one country to the other, right? We have in the United Kingdom huge amounts of wool, right? They have all of these sheep in the United Kingdom, and they'd send the wool down to Italy where the clothes were made, where textiles were manufactured, and they would bring the wool down, and then the people in Italy would pay them in gold, right? There was no common currency other than gold.
Yeah.
So they'd give them trunks of gold, put them on the ships, and the ships would sail back. And the Barbary pirates were capturing these. They would follow the ship in. They would watch these guys unload the wool. They would watch them load the gold on. They would capture the ship after it set sail, hold the people hostage, call the king, not call literally, but go to the king and say, we have all of your gold and we have all of your men. And if you'd like them back, here's what it's going to cost you. This leads Thomas Jefferson to get us into our first international conflict. We sent the Marines to Tripoli, to the Barbary coast.
It leads to the creation of the Marines.
Correct.
There was no Marine Corps before we had to figure out how to fight the Barbary pirates.
A couple of naval officers in 1801, 1802 lead 500 Marines on ships over to the coast of Tripoli to go fight. But in Europe, none of the kings wanted to fight these pirates. And so they just kept paying them. A group of Jews who had understood banking for years and years and years, one of them working in the Bank of London, say that they invent letters of credit. And they say, it was 5 brothers. They sent their brothers all over, one in the UK, one in France, one in Spain, one in Vienna, and one in Venice.
We can transfer papers rather than shipping big trunks full of gold.
So we're going to have these big vaults, and all my brothers are going to keep gold and keep other precious goods that you're going to need. And all you have to do is bring your wool to Italy. Give us the wool. We're going to give you a letter, and you just bring that letter to my brother in the United Kingdom, and he'll pay you the gold you're owed. So you don't have to worry about the Barbary pirates.
Yeah.
The Jews have done this for years. Now, it was a method of survival. And somehow that stereotype continues all the way through for these 1,000 years. And we now have people like Kanye making claims that, well, this is what the Jews do. They're just trying to control the world. All 13 million of them, this huge population, right? And I said earlier, there's some people who listen to him who it's unfortunate. The other people that scare me even more are the people who use Kanye's validation. And what's worse about it is Kanye was somebody they used to tolerate. right? These anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi, skinhead, KKK, whatever you want to call them. And all these groups have different names. And I think there's a lot of infighting among, I'm KKK, I'm neo-Nazi, and they don't like each other either. But you have all of these groups, and they used to tolerate Kanye, right? They don't like black people. They don't like hip hop music and rap music. And they don't like the fact that Kanye has all this money. They tolerated him though, as he started to become in favor of the things they were in favor of. They would tolerate him. And then all of a sudden now he's saying the things they want to say, and they get to say, see, I'm not racist. I'm not a bad person. Because I like Kanye. I like Kanye. And I'm just voicing that Kanye was right.
Yeah.
And we saw this in Los Angeles last week. There were groups on overpasses hanging signs that said Kanye was right and doing a Heil Hitler salute on overpasses all over Los Angeles, where, mind you, half of the U.S. Jewish population lives.
This this points to some really important categories, labels, terminology that gets thrown around in our politics, and I don't know if we can make sense of it all here. We're going to make sense of some of it. It really confuses. American politics today is so confused by the language and the terminology we employ. So we have these conservatives and the conservative movement, and that's one question: what exactly does it mean to be conservative? And then within conservatism, allegedly, certainly if you watch mainstream media, if you watch MSNBC or CNN, it's always described as these branches of conservatism, like the alt-right.
Yeah.
And the alt-right includes these kinds of groups who celebrate, Adolf Hitler and Nazism and, the German attempt to exterminate and control entire populations of people through modern scientific technology. And yet what Nazi Germany represented was the culmination, in a way, the perfection of the whole progressive attempt at social engineering.
Sure.
And a complete rejection. Nazi Germany was a rejection of the principles of the American founding. Mm-hmm. There was no recognition of individual natural rights. There was no concept of equal protection of the law. There was no emphasis on individualism, on the importance of individuals. It was all based on groups. You have favored groups and you have unfavored groups, and the favored groups would do horrific things to the unfavored groups. And so it's really confusing, right, to say that these groups that celebrate Nazism and Hitler and all of that somehow they're conservative.
Right.
If they're anything, they're proto or neo progressives. That's what they are. Because Nazism is a branch of progressivism. It's social engineering done with concentration camps and gas chambers and all those horrific things. That those things I just mentioned, those aren't a product of individual natural rights.
Right.
Those are a product of scientific engineers saying we need to help these groups and exterminate other groups. That's what will be good for society.
It's as if there's a belief that our spectrum, and we can talk about this a little bit and how to define it, but that the spectrum goes from communism and socialism to fascism, and that is the spectrum that we're living under, when in actuality, those are really just branches of authoritarianism.
That's right.
Right. And
I would actually say branches of progressivism.
Well, yes, I think they're just the same thing by different
scientific
names.
Control of society.
So progressivism to me would be one more definition of authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is there should be somebody in charge who is planning and deciding what happens within a society. Progressivism says it should be done via science. Socialism or communism says it should be done by some group that's been empowered. You have other groups that say whatever the mob says should be the authority of the regime. And then you've got the fascist side of we elect somebody like Adolf Hitler and he's going to take control, and or Mao or Lenin or Stalin or.
Well, and this points to, I mean, I've had a long disdain for the labels of right and left. That spectrum, that model, the idea that there is a right and there is a left, that stretches all the way back to the French Revolution. And it's really not applicable in any way to modern American politics today. In the French Revolution, there were two opposing sides. There was King Louis and his royal entourage and members of his royal family and everything that went along with a royal monarchy. And the people who were in support of him, there's a critical moment before the revolution. They literally lined up on his right side. They were to his right. They were supporters. Now, even in that moment, there's all kinds of confusion. Were those people who were in support of the king? Did they support this particular king? Was it King Louis XVI that they supported, or did they support the idea of kingship? Sure. Or did they say, well, maybe it's not this king. We're happy to replace him with some other king, but we want a king. Or were they supporting the way things are now? We don't really care about the king so much, but we just like the way we don't want a big disruption in our life. And the answer is probably all of the above. If you polled those people, you'd probably find something of all those different opinions. But that was on the right. And then on the left were the revolutionaries. These were the radicals. These are the people who become Jacobins, and that they eventually build guillotines and take members of the royal family and, just grotesquely cut their heads off in the street and put them in baskets and all that kind of ugliness. And so to take that model of right means supporting the current monarchy, left means let's cut the heads of monarchs off.
But not necessarily have no monarchs.
Well, there is a pushback. I mean, what we get from the Jacobins, we get a rejection of kingship. I mean, the whole problem with the French Revolution, what you end up getting is a rejection really of any kind of political rule at all. At all. Mm-hmm. Some people stand up and say, we think we need a Republican form of government. And the Jacobins turn on them, say, oh, you want to be in power now? We're going to cut your head off.
Right.
It's really, there's an element within the French Revolution of just anarchism, like opposition to any kind of government authority at all. And so to take that model, right means supporting the current monarch, left means opposition to the monarch and really all other forms of government, and apply it to modern American politics is deeply, deeply confusing. First of all, there's no monarch. Mm-hmm. There is no hereditary monarch here at all. Second of all, to say that you're a conservative and you support the status quo, I will sometimes call myself a conservative. I certainly want to. Here, I'll be very clear about this. I want to conserve. I want to protect. I want to defend the principles of the American Revolution. I think those are beautiful. They're good. They're just. They're right. But chances are, if you sat me, Dave, if you put me next to the most rabid, lefty, woke progressive, I'm quite confident I dislike more of America today, more of the American regime, more of the American government today than that lefty wokey. Because I can start going through federal bureaucratic agency one after another that I reject, I think shouldn't exist. Right. They should be abolished. They're illegitimate. Whereas the woke lefty, most of those would say, well, that's okay. Maybe we need to clean them up a little bit or make them more efficient, but they want them.
They don't just want to clean them up. They want to give them more power.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, IRS, let's just start there.
Right.
We are literally debating right now. We have an election in 2 weeks, less than, and in less than 2 weeks, the very first bill, if the Republicans take control of the House and the Senate, the very first bill is to reject this expansion of the IRS. And you have members of the left saying the IRS isn't bad. In fact, no, we want to give them more power, give them more guns, give them more authority, give them more control over Americans' day-to-day lives.
And it's not even, and here I'm going to say, so, I just angered woke lefties and now I'm going to say something that's probably going to anger some conservatives. It's not like conservatism is synonymous with increased liberty or increased respect for property rights. An example of that is the war on drugs. There are a few groups in America who are more supportive of an unconstitutional federal drug code and all the federal agencies and judges and prisons and prison wardens and everything that goes along with it. Few people are more supportive of that than conservatives. Conservatives tend to support that. So they're not out there demanding limited constitutional government and individual liberty. They're perfectly willing to control other people's choices and lives. It's just in ways that are different from most progressives.
I'm going to put a sharper edge on that.
Okay.
And again, you just said this is going to anger some conservatives. There's a lot of people who hear us say that and they think, oh, that's not me. He's talking about other people. That's not me. If you have sat down at any point in time and said, we never should have legalized pot in Colorado, right? We have a huge portion of our listeners are in Colorado, of our members. If you have sat down and said, we never should have legalized marijuana in Colorado, has it been good? Have the results been good? No, there's been a rise in crime. There's been a rise in homelessness. There's been a lot of bad effects, but that's control. And that is one of those things that we have to address why things are going in that way, not try to restrict control. And if you are a conservative who says, I'm conserving a certain way of life rather than the principles of the founding, that's what always gets me with the word conservative and why I always get uncomfortable using that myself. I'm like you. I want to conserve the ideas of the American founding. If you want to call me a conservative for that reason, I'm in. I'll happily wear that badge. But if you want me to conserve a certain way of life, an idea of the way life is supposed to be lived, and you want to create laws that control people into living that kind of life, I think we've all seen where that ends up going. You cannot control people and stop it at a certain level. And eventually that's how we get to where we are today.
We also have this huge problem. Again, just to reinforce this, I don't like the labels of right and left. I don't think they're helpful. I think they're more confusing than anything. I really don't like the label conservative. We live in a regime. You and I have been talking here in recent podcasts, whether the United States actually is a constitutional republic, a self-governing constitutional republic. And at best, it's a very debatable question. One can certainly make persuasive arguments that we have transformed into something that's not a self-governing constitutional republic, that really there's an elite class, a political class, and their crony friends in the business world and the corporate world and the media world who really decide what the government's going to be, not ordinary voting citizens. To that extent, then, I don't want to conserve that.
Right.
That big administrative state that the United States has become, I don't want to conserve that. In that sense, I'm a kind of radical. I want to abolish. I want to repeal. I want to defund and get rid of many aspects of modern American government that never should have been created in the first place. I'm going to add another sharp edge. If you call yourself conservative, you say, I'm a proud, patriotic American, and you fly your flag and you call yourself conservative, and you say, yeah, I'm with Kanye. I like what Kanye says. Or maybe you think, that's just not worth commenting on. You just ignore him. You're not conserving the principles of the American Revolution. You're out there either explicitly or implicitly giving support to a guy who is espousing tribal hatred. The American founding was not about tribal hatred. The American founding was the exact opposite. In the summer of 1858, Lincoln gave this speech in right around the 4th of July, Independence Day. And it's a beautiful speech. And there's a little section in there. I sometimes refer to it as his electric cord speech. And he's commenting on the fact that in Chicago, there's a big, big audience out there. He says, many people here in the audience can trace by blood their connection to the founding fathers, right, or the families of the founding generation. But he says, but we also have right here in this audience, many people who can't.
Yeah.
Many people whose parents or grandparents came over to the United States after the founding. They have no blood connection to any of the original American families. And of course, everyone in the audience, anyone with a brain would be thinking, yeah, there are some Germans here and some Scandinavians here and some French here who some Chinese here, right? There's some people from South America here who can't trace by blood any connection to the founding. But of course, a thoughtful observer would also realize, and there are slaves and descendants of slaves who don't have blood connection to the founders. And then Lincoln turns and says, but when those old men wrote in the Declaration that all men are created equal and every human being is endowed by his creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then these immigrants here who are happy, productive Americans, they realize that they are blood of the blood, flesh of the flesh with the American founders, because America is about this idea. And if you accept that idea, that's what it means to be an American, not to have a certain blood running through your veins. It's about this wonderful idea. What Kanye is out there spouting off about is an utter rejection of those ideas. You're Jewish, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
When you accept and imbibe and defend, when you're a guardian of the American idea, you're a great American. And it doesn't matter what kind or whose blood is running through your veins any more than mine. I've got German blood running through my veins, and I'm the farthest thing from a Nazi or an admirer of that regime. I want the ideas of the founding. So you can't be a conservative in that sense. You can't be a conservative who defends the principles of the founding and be out there celebrating yay.
Right. You also, you mentioned don't just stand by and let it happen.
Yeah.
Now I want to clarify that, because I know you're not saying, and I want to make sure everybody knows, neither of us are saying we want the American government to go stop him from saying this.
Yeah, no.
Right.
No.
There is absolutely not a piece of me that says, I wish we lived in a country where the government would stop Kanye from saying crazy things like this and inciting these neo-Nazis to want to kill me even more than they already did. No, what I want Americans to stand up and engage Kanye, and not just engage him with anger, and not just engage him with, Kanye, you're ridiculous. And hey, there's been this massive campaign on Twitter. Hey, Adidas, why haven't you dropped Kanye yet? Right. Kanye.
Actually, I believe Adidas just did.
Did they?
Yes.
But this has been going on and on.
Sure.
Right. He's no longer with his bank. Creative Artists Agency has dropped him. People are dropping him, and that's the market effect. That's the benefit of free markets.
Right.
As soon as somebody becomes no longer valuable, if he's not offering value to those companies, they have a means of getting out of that obligation to him. But neither of us want the United States government to step in. What we want are guardians of the American idea standing up. And I really went after Daily Wire on Twitter over this, because not only did Kanye say this, but Candace Owens stood up and supported the comments and backed him. And she says, and all of you are now calling to cancel me. And I repeatedly started talking to them, and specifically to Jeremy Boring, who's the CEO, saying, wait a minute, this is not the answer in America. The answer is not to cancel Candace.
Right.
The answer is not to cancel Kanye. The answer is you have two Jews in your orbit, one who is a president emeritus of your company, another who is a significant partner in Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager,
right,
who are very well versed in the American founding, who are very well versed in these ideas, and
both have gigantic spheres of influence,
right? And are Orthodox Jews.
Yeah,
let them engage. Daily Wire, you have this enormous platform.
Yeah,
engage. Get Kanye, get Candace, get them on at a table, get them on a couch, get them on in front of the people, and let's have a conversation, because that's how you defend the American idea. Have Dennis Prager and have Ben Shapiro explain to him why his ideas are not American. He is not being a good steward of the American idea by spouting off these ideas. And if he really believes them, then somebody needs to explain to him what the real history
is. And let's be clear, Miss Owens would benefit greatly from that discussion, from that, I think, from that lesson. I mean, she's a bright young woman. I think she has learned much in recent years.
Mhm.
And she's full of all kinds of energy, and she's bright and ambitious. It would be great to hear her view. Like, what is it that Kanye's saying that she agrees with,
Right.
and why? And actually have that kind of conversation.
The concern I have is she's arguing for his right to say it. And too many other people are saying, no, he shouldn't have a right to say it. And they're totally detracting from what the real conversation should be.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to go back to your comment about you not liking this spectrum.
Yeah.
You and I come at it from a little bit of a different perspective, but not totally. To me, that spectrum, you and I both have political science, academic backgrounds.
Right.
Yours much more thorough than mine. Right. I mean, you spent master's and PhD time doing it. I ended at the end of my bachelor's, but there is a benefit in an academic classroom when you're studying the history of ideas, when you're studying the history of political ideas, to understand a spectrum of authoritarianism all the way to or totalitarianism and the different forms that it takes, like we were talking earlier, whether that's socialism or fascism or something else, progressivism, all the way to this idea of anarchy, and understanding the dangers in both, right? I don't think either of us would sit here and say, well, we certainly don't like authoritarianism or totalitarianism or progressivism. Right. So we want anarchy. Right. And so many people make this argument that, oh, well, if you don't like option A, you must want total anarchy and the elimination of all law and all rule and live in a state of nature. No, there actually is a spectrum and there's a gray area and we can decide, okay, how close to anarchy do we want to be? How close to some version of progressivism, totalitarianism do we want to be? Where on that spectrum should we fall?
It's also important to know, like, where are we trending? I actually have a number of progressives who follow me on social media, and I was challenging one time a certain regulation as being obnoxious and unjust. And this progressive woman responded. She said, "Oh, Krannawer, you're just an anarchist. You want no regulations and no laws at all. You want no government." I said, hold on a second. When we start repealing almost all agencies and regulations and laws, and we're getting close to zero, let's have a discussion about anarchy.
Right.
When that looks like a real possibility. That's not where we're trending. We're going the other direction. We're hitting 100,000 pages a year of new regulations. Like, anarchy is not our problem. We're going the other way. What we really need to be talking about is how desirable is a totalitarian state. Because that's the direction we're moving.
Right. And from that perspective, I think the spectrum is a worthwhile conversation. The problem is that conversation should generally or has generally been an academic conversation. It's something that you talk about in academic circles in a classroom as you're trying to understand the various forms. What happened with this spectrum, as with so many other things in our society, is we have a group of people in the media who have picked this up, who don't actually understand it, who don't actually understand what they're referring to, and they're trying to sound like they do. And somehow this spectrum has been changed from totalitarian to anarchy into Democrat to Republican, and that Democrat and Republican are the ends of the spectrum, which makes you one or the other. And that's when you start getting words like the alt-right, right? If Republican is on, I keep using my right, but if we're on camera and for you, the right is over here, right? If I'm all the way over here and that's considered Republican, but you start to define what Republican is, and Republican is not, if Republican is the conservation of the American idea,
right?
Well, clearly neo-Nazis don't believe this, but that group in Los Angeles that was flying the Kanye was right flag and giving the Hitler salute, they also were hanging an American flag. And the media has decided that the American flag is the symbol of the Republican Party. So therefore, they don't fit this. So we're just going to create another fork in this. And that's where that term alt-right comes from.
Just to summarize this, right, there are somewhere around 80 or 100,000, or I'm sorry, 100 million progressive Americans today, about half the country, who think conservative, right-wing, Republican, those labels are all synonymous with hating Jews, hating blacks, hating gays.
Right.
And that's for a large number of American progressives, it kind of stops. It's all they need to know. They hate gays, they hate blacks. So we reject right-wingism, we reject conservatism, we reject republicanism. What's the alternative? Mm-hmm. And that's why they consider themselves progressives. It would be a great exercise. It'd be a clarifying moment to go interview these alt-right types standing there with their swastikas tattooed on them and all that crap, and ask them, what is it about America you think you like? When you wave that American flag, what does that flag represent to you? What is it there that you like? Mm-hmm. Because their answer is going to point to something that is opposite from the Declaration of Independence.
Right. They're going to want to control people. They're going to want to have certain groups more powerful than others. They don't believe in equal application of the law. They don't believe that they don't even believe that all people are human.
The most honest of the alt-right types, the neo-Nazi types, the honest ones. We've been angering a lot of groups. So I'm going to anger one more group, and that's anyone from the South or with Southern roots. The honest ones fly a Confederate flag because there's a lot of similarities there, right? Divide people into groups, pretend that some aren't fully human or they don't have the same rights, exclude some from protection of the law, let them be treated like property. There's the parallel between alt-right Nazis and American history. It would be that Confederate flag and everything it stood for. And then now we're going to get people are going to push back and say, whoa. That Confederate flag was all about states' rights. It had nothing to do with tribalism.
Well, so here's the gray area. And this is why the spectrum exists. The way the media paints the spectrum is you're either all the way on the right or you're all the way on the left, and you're either a Republican or you're a Democrat, and there's no gray area. And they come up with this term moderate as if you're somewhere in between a Republican and a Democrat.
Right.
Which makes no sense, right? I can't be a moderate Democrat or a moderate Republican. I can believe in certain things that I believe in what the Republican Party stood for under Lincoln, right? And if that's me, how is that a moderate? What makes that moderate? Does that mean I'm not as, according to the media, I guess that means I'm not as racist as how they define Republicans. So that makes me moderate.
Well, and it also ignores the reality, the very real strategizing that goes on in elections. The media will present everyone who votes Republican must agree with everything. And think of how many people, Dave, think of how many people you and I know personally who in the last two elections said, I don't like Donald Trump. There's a lot about him that turns me off. However, for example, I think if he gets the opportunity, he might try to appoint some constitutionalists to the court. And so I'm going to vote for him for that one, because I know the Democrat, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, it has no interest in constitutionalists on the court. So they won't even try. I think Donald Trump might try, so I'm going to vote for him for that one reason. I know many people who made that calculation and made that choice. Does that mean that person agrees with everything Donald Trump says and does and tweets? And no, not at all.
And here's where that gets even more interesting. The media would call that person a moderate. They would call that person somewhere in the middle of the scale. If you go to the totalitarian versus anarchy scale, they're probably further to the anarchy side
than Donald
Trump is himself.
Correct.
Which is why this whole thing got screwed up so badly. So I actually do think there could be a lot of value in having this conversation. Yeah. We've talked at length about the Overton window. That Overton window falls somewhere on the anarchy to totalitarian spectrum, not on the Republican to Democrat. We don't have an Overton window that sits on the entire spectrum, because that's where it would say we are. But instead, it should sit on that totalitarian versus anarchy spectrum. And we should know where we as a people are comfortable in terms of how much control do we want to allow our government to have over our daily lives.
Dave, you're the of the two of us, you're the one who knows about branding, not me. There's your assignment. There's your homework. is figure out how to take that spectrum of totalitarianism on one extreme to anarchy on the other, and then understanding political reality is somewhere in between, right? Every actual regime is somewhere in between, and brand that and make that something that makes sense, that's common, right? Because it's far clearer. If we actually had that kind of spectrum, and we had totalitarianism on one end, meaning total government control,
right,
of everything. Think of George Orwell's 1984, right? Total government control of everything. You have to ask permission to do anything, to go to the grocery store, to make a phone call, anything. And then you have anarchy at the other, no government at all. Most governments in the world today would fall somewhere down here pretty close to the totalitarian end. Fascism would be down there. Venezuela, a socialist regime, a communist paradise like the Soviet Union or China would be way down there. The progressive administrative state in the United States would be down there, right? You got to go get permits and ask bureaucrats for permission to make your driveway bigger or to start a business or to do anything. All of that would fall way down there. And it would start to make more sense than this left-right conservative Democrat distinction.
Where I challenge people to think is, if all these governments fall down towards that totalitarian, let's just say left. If the totalitarian was the left side, they're left of center, right? Almost every government in the world is left of center. Where was the U.S. Constitution on that scale? Where was the U.S. Constitution or the Declaration? Where were our founders? Where did they want America to be? And that becomes a very, very fascinating question. Not only where did they want us to be, but were they right?
Yep.
I mean, I think it's hard to argue that they wanted us closer to the anarchy end of the scale, and hard to argue against the fact that they wanted us up towards the anarchy end of the scale. And the big question is, were they right? And if they were, then that's the idea we need to defend.
Yeah, the founding starts to look like an outlier,
right,
on that kind of spectrum, and it's a really clarifying exercise. Well, look, I hope this discussion helped some people, helped some of our listeners not be so easily distracted or confused by these terms, right, left, conservative, alt-right, things like this, and start thinking in terms of total government power versus very little or no government power, control over your life. Do you want more? You want more? You want other people to have more control? I mean, that really is that's the progressive program, is to try to persuade people not enough of your life is controlled by others. More of it needs to be controlled. And should we agree with that, or should we push back and reject it? Those of us who want to guard the American idea, we have a real problem with that.
Well, that's what you said earlier, that is the job. If you want to guard the American idea, is to actually understand where it is on that spectrum. And that's why we say, no somos custodes.
Till next time.